First off, though, is a story coming from English footballing organisations including the FA, Premier League and EFL amongst others, who last week wrote an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, concerning the abuse that players, officials and others have been receiving online.
Yeah, and an interesting time for it to come out. Obviously, this is going to, one's caused the other, but we've seen a lot in recent weeks of players coming out who are receiving abuse on Instagram, either racist abuse or sexist abuse. Obviously, we covered last week Mike Dean getting death threats online. There was Ian Wright, who had an abuse issue, which went to court a couple of weeks ago. So we've seen a lot of this coming up lately, and it seems to have come to a head here with this letter, which you mentioned there, it was amongst a few other organisations. In total, it was the Premier League, the FA, EFL, WSL, Women's Championship, PFA, LMA, PG Bowl, and Kick It Out that all co-signed this open letter. So it's pretty much every major footballing body in the UK that have come together on this, which we don't really see that often, and says quite a bit about it. And they've written this letter asking them for reasons of basic human decency to use the power of their systems to end the abuse. And it has sparked quite an interesting topic of conversation, because I think, broadly speaking, most people agree that abuse of footballers isn't great. Even the people who are the abusers themselves probably would complain about it when it happened to the players of their team, unless they're the ones abusing their own players. But I'm sure, everyone has an issue with it. So I don't think that calling for the end of really, really outrageous abuse is in itself a controversial topic. But I do think some of the stuff surrounding it is. Looking at the list of demands, if that's even the correct, the request that the football authority put to Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, sure.
They'd asked that messages and posts should be filtered and blocked before being sent or posted if they contain racist or discriminatory material. They asked that the companies should operate robust, transparent and swift measures to take down abusive material if it does get into circulation. And these first two, I think, really no one would have a problem with, unless you really are dedicated to being a keyboard warrior, which I think we can agree is the minority. The vast majority of people don't really have a problem with it. Where it starts to get a little bit murky, for one reason, and we'll be talking about why the whole thing is potentially good or bad and where the issues and solutions are. But this third one, all users should be subject to an improved verification process that allows for accurate identification of the person behind the account. Steps should also be taken to stop a user that has sent abuse previously from re-registering an account. And fourth, I'll get to that in a second, fourth and finally is our platforms should actively and expeditiously assist the investigating authorities in identifying the originators of illegal discriminatory material. And I think where a lot of people have got a little bit defensive over this topic is the idea of identification on social media platforms. Obviously, that is one very effective way to reduce the amount of sort of anonymous snarkiness that people have because they sort of feel they're safe to do it. But at the same time, there are some interesting concerns that have been raised about, government-issued ID being used online to make sure everyone's sort of identified. Roops, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just I was really interested to note as you mentioned, the demands that they've laid out, because they seem counter to kind of the way that the public opinion is moving, and also the way that the government is moving. And it strikes me as something that is confusing, because they, as organizations, work very closely with people like Facebook and Twitter. I think, for example, Facebook is part of the organizational body that helps run Kick It Out. Mm-hmm. So Facebook very much involved in these organizations. And there is the other part of this to note is that it's very much something that's coming to a head in legislative arguments with the government, as I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So in December of last year, a research report was produced by the government, which was titled the Online Harms White Paper. And it's basically setting out legislation which the government is looking to undertake, which would require companies to just kind of prevent the spreading of illegal content and activity online, ensure that children who use their services aren't exposed, as well as, celebrities and people who have a bigger platform. And it also kind of stated that it would be holding the largest tech companies like Facebook and Twitter to account for what they say they are doing. Not just what they're doing, but what they say they are doing. This is a government paper released 2 months ago to tackle activity and content that is harmful to adults using their services. Exactly how this is all going to happen has not yet been entirely revealed by the government, other than saying that the level of responsibility and action needed by companies will be tiered based on the type of platform. So there'll be tier 2 companies, which are smaller things, and then tier 1 companies like Facebook and Twitter that need to do a lot to address this. It's a really interesting further development to be aware of. And in that sense, reading that sort of legislation, it does seem like, as you mentioned, what the FA and all of these other bodies are demanding is not only extreme, but also not very practical.
Well, I think a big part of it, and one of the largest pieces of criticism that's been levelled at these footballing bodies, has been that these things need to be sort of a multi-layered approach. Obviously, social media has a huge part to play here, but so too do the football authorities and who they can hold to account for these things, and also obviously the legal system in various countries. We had the example I mentioned earlier of Ian Wright, who had the person who sent racial abuse to him was identified and went to court, but hasn't been convicted. So it's further than just the social media. And I think the FA and all these other bodies have been quite keen to almost foist the responsibility and pass the buck. Facebook's content policy manager came out and talked about how, racism in football, the exact quote was, she was like, racism in football is a bigger problem than just abusive messages on social media. And I think that's very true. I think that, racism in football didn't start when Twitter started or when Facebook started. I think you could make the case that it's been worsened, but I think football needs to take a look at itself and the areas it can affect, whether that's through broadcasting or things of that nature, or just promotion, how they can reduce it. As an example, last year, a Danish research firm called Run Repeat took a look at 2,000 statements made across 80 games by English football commentators, and they were looking at them typically using differing terms for players based on ethnicity. And they proved that there was a bias whereby players with lighter skins are usually praised for intelligence, work ethic and quality, whereas those with darker skins are reduced to their more physical attributes like pace and power. Likewise, when a lighter skinned player loses the ball, it's a bit more, he's cheeky, he's clever, whereas when a dark skinned player loses the ball, it's, that was clumsy, that was lazy, he's not really switched on. So you look at things like this, if it's been examined over 2,000 statements, pretty solid bit of research there, and that's just something you see in the game. You've obviously still got players like, or pundits rather, like Graham Souness, who cannot wait to jump down the throats of players like Paul Pogba for being lazy, or publications like the Daily Mail, which will regularly lambast players like Tosin Adarabioyo and praise Phil Foden for doing the same thing, which was last year when they both bought their mums' houses. So it's not to say, these people who, abuse players and pundits and referees online should be absolved of blame. But what I'm saying is it's all well and good to have a go at social media for providing the anonymity that allows these people to abuse them. But where do they get the idea that it's anywhere okay in the first place? Where do these ideas of sort of, if Graham Souness is writing half of the tweet for you, it's not just Twitter's fault.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, it's definitely something that predates, both the platforms and probably football as well, and something that doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So clearly a lot of work is needed from the grassroots up, and by the grassroots up I mean it needs to start at the lowest possible level and reach the highest possible level in all forms. So I definitely fully agree with you there. And it's, growing up, absolutely it was still a part of the game back in 2000, like the early noughties, and the late kind of 2005, 2010 kind of time. Every few weeks there were different examples coming out of players receiving abuse and things like that, and bringing up the use of words as well and rhetoric is really interesting, because it kind of just speaks to how deeply ingrained it is in people, even if they ostensibly probably even believe that they themselves are not racist or engage in racist profiling, they still have prejudices. So I think that
absolutely, and I think that's what the study showed, because it wasn't just, I've singled out, for example, Graham Souness as an example there, maybe just because he's one of the more prevalent examples, but this was 80 different games, 2,000 statements, so a real deep bench and wide examination of hundreds of different pundits, and there's still one definite conclusion that's drawn from that. So I think it suggests one or two things. Either all pundits are massively racist, which I just don't think is the case at all, or there are some underlying prejudices that do need to be addressed when people are broadcasting, because, eventually people watch people on the TV, and that becomes part of the language that you co-opt yourself.
Yeah, well, I think that, as we've talked about, definitely football often struggles to hold itself accountable, and if there was anything that needed more work, it was that within the game. And I think, as you've kind of alluded to, the worry is that it's currently falling through the cracks, because football is claiming that social media is the thing that needs to reform itself, and social media is claiming that football had these problems way before they were even around. And both have a kernel of truth to them, in that, obviously social media is the used platform for a lot of this abuse, and also that, of course, racism predates social media. But if both of these bodies are trying to just pass it off onto each other, then what action is being taken, what new things are coming to light. And the other interesting development is just that English football has not only reached out to social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, but they've also reached out to America and American football organizations like the NBA and the NFL, because not only is America the origin and the place where these companies are based, Facebook and Twitter, it's also something very much going on in America, with a lot of high profile athletes receiving the same kind of abuse over there. So could we be seeing the first kind of establishing of international ground rules, potentially? Could it be another frustrating merry-go-round of everyone refusing to claim responsibility for, what they could do to help? Also, possibly.
That's the thing, really, isn't it? Because when I saw this letter last week, my first thought was, I was like, wow, okay, so the FA and all these other bodies are actually stepping up. When you see, it's a letter written to try and combat abuse, and then you read a little bit into the actual specific language of it, and there was one sentence in particular that just caught my eye, and it was these bodies stating, we cannot succeed in reducing the abuse until you change the ability of offenders to remain anonymous. And maybe that's just a poorly worded thing, or they're trying to sort of be dramatic to get their case across. But I think they absolutely can succeed in reducing abuse, not eradicate it entirely without Facebook. But it smacks to me as them sort of going, well, we're going to personally and publicly state right now that it's not our fault that it's continuing. It's all social media. And there was a part of me that was like, are they sidestepping their own duty to tackle this problem in doing that? Because to me, it felt a bit like they might be.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. And I think the other thing that maybe points to that being true is that in some ways it kind of reads like a first draft, in that some of the claims that they're making are a little outlandish, some of the stuff that they're demanding, that is, by these companies. And just to be perfectly honest, my first instinct when I went onto the FA's website to read their open letter was that they'd made a typo in the subheading. So is it just kind of, they've hashed out this something which is quite aggressive, as you say, a little bit dramatic, try and flare up people's attention to it, maybe to urge social media to be accountable rather than themselves? Or is it a genuine attempt with feeling? Because definitely the first part, I felt like it was stronger than I thought it was going to be, and I thought that was not necessarily a bad thing. We see so much rhetoric, and for an open letter to come out where they're literally saying, like, this needs to change, you need to do this, this, and this, at least in theory, creates dialogue. This is obviously going to be a conversation which doesn't have any definitive answers, because it's such a broad topic to discuss how the game needs to be regulated, how social media needs to be regulated. But it's really interesting to note how it can be read in two very different ways.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that sending an open letter like this, and at least making the official the official stance of all these bodies that they oppose this abuse and having that, is a step forwards. But it's just a question if that's a step forwards and 2 steps back, or just a step forwards.
I think ultimately, hopefully, it will be a step forward, because the more this is talked about, the more this is emphasized, the more people that recognize it as a concern, I think generally the more accountable we will hold people as like a broad rule. But in the short term, I'm not sure if it's going to lead to anything constructive.
Well, we'll have to wait and see how this story develops.